Something quiet has been happening beneath the surface of modern relationships, and most men don't see it until it's already cost them everything they thought they were building. You can watch it in real time if you know where to look. A man meets a woman. There's attraction, possibility, the electric promise of something real, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he begins to rearrange his life around her presence. Not dramatically, not all at once, just small adjustments. He changes his Friday night plans. He texts back a little too fast. He starts explaining himself when he doesn't need to. He begins negotiating with his own boundaries before she even asks him to. And somewhere in that process, something fundamental shifts. The thing she was initially drawn to, that quiet self-possession, that sense that he existed independent of her approval, begins to dissolve. And with it, the desire dissolves too. You see this pattern everywhere once you start looking for it. The man who stops going to the gym because she doesn't like how much time it takes. The man who apologizes for having male friends she finds annoying. The man who abandons his Saturday morning routine, his side projects, his periods of solitude, because she interprets them as rejection. He thinks he's building intimacy. He thinks he's proving his commitment. He believes that if he can show her how much he cares, how available he is, how willing he is to center his world around hers, she'll finally feel secure. But the opposite happens. The more he gives, the less she respects. The more he explains, the less she trusts. The more he sacrifices his structure, the less she is attracted to him. And he's left confused, exhausted, quietly resenting her for something he can't quite name, because the thing he wanted most, her desire, evaporated the moment he stopped protecting his own boundaries. Carl Jung understood this mechanism long before the language of modern psychology gave us sanitized terms for it. He saw that what we call love is often projection, shadow, unconscious hunger dressed up as devotion. He knew that a man who loses himself in a woman isn't loving her. He's collapsing into her, using her as a container for the inner structure he never built himself. And Jung knew something else, something most men never hear. The feminine doesn't respect collapse. It can't. At a level deeper than conscious thought, deeper than what anyone will admit in polite conversation, the feminine is constantly testing for structure. Not because women are cruel, but because nature is efficient. If a man has no boundaries, if he can be emotionally moved and rearranged by her moods, her requests, her withdrawal of approval, then at a biological level, he has failed the only test that actually matters. He is not a safe place. He is not on solid ground. He is just another source of uncertainty in an already uncertain world. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why this keeps happening, not just to other men, but to you. And you'll see what it quietly destroys if you pretend it isn't real. Jung spent much of his life studying the architecture of the psyche, watching how human beings construct meaning, identity, and relationships out of unconscious material they don't understand. He lived through 2 world wars, watched entire civilizations collapse under the weight of their own repressed shadows, and he saw the same patterns playing out in individual lives. Men who believed they were making conscious, rational decisions about love, only to discover decades later that they'd been sleepwalking through someone else's script. Women who thought they wanted safety and devotion, only to find themselves contemptuous of the very men who provided it. Jung called this the problem of the anima and animus, the unconscious feminine in men, the unconscious masculine in women, and he knew that when a man doesn't integrate his own inner structure, he projects it outward onto a woman and then spends the rest of his life trying to get her approval as a substitute for self-respect. Here's the thesis, and it runs like a steel thread through everything that follows. A man without boundaries becomes the kind of man no woman can desire, because desire doesn't respond to availability, it responds to structure. The moment you make yourself endlessly flexible, endlessly accommodating, endlessly available for emotional labor you didn't sign up for, you stop being a man she's attracted to and become a psychological resource she unconsciously resents, not because she's evil, not because women are broken or manipulative, but because at a level deeper than language, attraction is a response to containment, to self-possession, to the sense that a man exists independent of her emotional weather. The man who has boundaries isn't withholding love. He's demonstrating the only kind of stability that actually matters, the stability of someone who doesn't need her approval to know who he is. This shows up everywhere once you see it. The man who cancels plans with his closest friends because she had a bad day and needs him available. He thinks he's being supportive. She experiences it as a weakness. The man who explains his decisions in obsessive detail, as if her understanding is required for him to act. He thinks he's being transparent. She experiences it as a request for permission. The man who constantly checks in, continually asks how she's feeling, and continuously tries to manage her emotional state, as if it's his responsibility. He thinks he's being attentive. She experiences it as the behavior of someone who has no center, no mission, no life that exists separately from her. And the brutal irony is this: the more he does these things, the more anxious she becomes. Because if he can be moved so easily by her moods, if his structure is that fragile, then what happens when the real storms come? What happens when life actually gets hard? Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But he also knew that transformation requires two distinct substances. If one person is shapeless, if one person is just liquid waiting to take the form of the other's container, there's no transformation, there's only absorption. And the person doing the absorbing will eventually feel suffocated by the very presence they thought they wanted. You see this in the way a woman's tone changes over time. Early on, there's warmth, curiosity, a kind of playful testing. Later, after the man has proven he has no edges, no lines he won't cross, no part of his life he protects from her emotional demands, the tone shifts. It becomes sharp, dismissive, and chronically dissatisfied. Not because he stopped caring, but because he stopped being a separate person. And you cannot desire what you've already consumed. Let me tell you about a man I worked with a few years ago. Successful by every external measure, good income, good shape, socially competent. He'd been with his girlfriend for 2 years, and by his account he'd done everything right. He communicated his feelings, he was emotionally available, he prioritized needs, he made sure she felt seen, heard, and validated. And she left him anyway for a man who, on paper, had less to offer. The man she chose didn't text as much, didn't explain himself as thoroughly, didn't rearrange his life to accommodate her schedule. And the client sat across from me, genuinely confused, asking the question every man in this position asks: what did I do wrong? The answer, of course, is that he did nothing wrong by the standards he'd been taught. He followed the script perfectly, he just followed the bad script. Because the script he was given, be sensitive, be available, prioritize feelings above your own structure, was written by people who don't understand how desire actually works. Here's what was really happening underneath. Every time he cancelled his own plans to be available for her, he was communicating, "My life has no structure without you." Every time he over-explained his decisions, he was communicating, "I need your approval to act." Every time he absorbed her bad moods and made them his problem to solve, he was communicating, "I have no emotional boundaries, no separate self, no center that exists independently of your state." And at an unconscious level, she registered all of it, not as love, not as devotion, but as evidence that he couldn't hold his own weight. The man she later pursued had less to offer materially, but he had one thing the client didn't. He had a life that continued whether she was in it or not. He had plans he didn't cancel. He had the time he didn't give. He had a psychological structure that didn't bend every time she applied pressure. And that structure, that refusal to collapse, created the only kind of safety that actually generates desire. This is where most men get lost. They think boundaries are about being cold, distant, and withholding affection. They think having structure means being an arsehole, but that's not what this is. Jung wasn't talking about cruelty. He was talking about differentiation, the ability to remain yourself in the presence of another person's emotions, the ability to care deeply about someone without making their emotional state your responsibility, the ability to love without collapsing. And that ability, that capacity to remain separate while staying connected, is what creates the energetic charge that desire requires. When a woman knows she can't move you with her moods, when she knows you'll stay consistent, even when she's upset, when she knows your mission and your structure exist independently of her approval, she stops testing. Not because she's been defeated, but because she's found what she was testing for, solid ground. The man who doesn't understand this spends years cycling through the same confusion. He enters a relationship with energy, purpose, and a sense of self. And then, gradually, he begins to shrink. He stops calling his friends as much because she doesn't like how loud they are. He stops going to the gym consistently because she comments that he's always working out. He stops pursuing his side business, his creative projects, and his periods of solitude because they take time away from her, and she interprets that as him not caring. And every time he sacrifices a piece of his structure, he thinks he's building the relationship. But he's not. He's eroding the only foundation the relationship could ever stand on. And then one day, he wakes up and realizes he doesn't recognize himself anymore. His routines are gone. His hobbies are gone. His sense of direction is gone. And the woman he gave all of it up to looks at him with contempt. She can't even articulate because the man she fell for no longer exists. Jung called this the problem of inflation and deflation. When a man has no inner structure, he inflates in the presence of a woman's approval and deflates in the presence of her withdrawal. His mood, decisions, and sense of self-worth rise and fall in response to her reactions, and the woman can feel that. She can feel when a man is using her as the axis. His entire emotional world spins. And it repels her, not because she's shallow, but because it's too much weight. No one wants to be someone else's entire psychological infrastructure. No one wants to be the sole source of another person's meaning. It's exhausting, it's suffocating, and eventually, it's unbearable. Now zoom out from the individual man and look at the system he's trying to navigate. Because this confusion isn't just personal, it's civilizational. Live in a culture that has systematically punished masculine boundaries while demanding infinite masculine responsibility. A man is told to be emotionally open, but if he's too open, he's weak. He's said to be sensitive, but if he's too sensitive, he's unattractive. He's said to communicate his feelings, but if his feelings include frustration, boundaries, or expectations, he's labeled controlling. The rules are deliberately contradictory, and the punishment for getting it wrong is social and legal annihilation. A man can lose his job, his reputation, his children, his financial future, not because he did anything illegal, but because he failed to manage someone else's emotional interpretation of his actions. And so men learn to walk on eggshells, to apologize preemptively, to shrink themselves to survive. And then they wonder why women don't desire them anymore. Jung saw this same pattern in the collective psyche of entire societies. When a culture loses contact with its own structure, when it can no longer name what it values or defend what it believes, it begins to collapse inward. The masculine becomes apologetic, self-erasing, endlessly deferential. The feminine becomes anxious, chaotic, and unable to trust anything because nothing is solid anymore. And the whole system starts eating itself. You see this in the dating market, where women report being unable to find men they respect, and men report being terrified to approach women because the cost of misreading a signal is too high. You see it in the epidemic of sexless marriages, where men describe feeling like they're in a contract they didn't agree to, and women describe feeling attraction to everyone except the man they're with. You see it in the growing number of men who stop participating altogether, not out of hatred or bitterness, but out of exhaustion. Because if the game is rigged, if your best efforts are met with contempt, if your boundaries are labeled toxicity and your needs are dismissed as entitlement, then walking away isn't cowardice, it's basic self-preservation. Here's the cost of staying blind to this, of pretending it's not real, of convincing yourself that if you try harder, give more, explain better, it will work out. You lose your mission. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like water eroding stone. You stop working on the business idea because it takes time. You stop training as hard because it's easier not to fight about it. You stop reading, creating, and building because all of that requires solitude and energy, and you've used up every last bit managing her emotions. And then 5 years pass and you look around and realize you've built nothing, no progress, no momentum, no legacy, just an exhausted, resentful version of yourself serving a woman who doesn't even want the version of you that you've become. And the worst part is, she didn't ask for this. You offered it. You volunteered to dismantle yourself piece by piece in exchange for approval you never got anyway. Jung understood that the shadow always returns. The parts of yourself you abandon, the boundaries you refuse to set, the standards you compromise, they don't disappear. They go underground. They turn into resentment, passive aggression, quiet bitterness that poisons everything it touches. The man who can't say no becomes the man who says yes with clenched teeth. The man who can't protect his own time becomes the man who silently tallies every sacrifice and throws it back in her face during the following argument. The man who refuses to hold his structure becomes the man who explodes when that structure finally collapses, and everyone pretends to be shocked, as if the collapse came out of nowhere, when the truth is it was inevitable the moment he decided his boundaries were negotiable. So let's talk about what sovereignty actually looks like, without turning this into a cheap list of tactics, because the point isn't to manipulate anyone. The fact is to stop betraying yourself. The proof is in building a life where your structure is non-negotiable, where your mission is protected, where your time and attention are currencies you spend deliberately, not resources other people take by default. First, notice when you're about to cancel something that matters to you because it's easier than having the conversation. Your gym session, your weekly call with a friend, your Saturday morning silence. Whatever keeps you connected to yourself, notice the moment when you're about to sacrifice it to avoid her disappointment, and then stop. Don't explain, don't apologize, to build a case for why you're allowed to have your own life. Just say, "I've got plans," and let her react however she does. And here's the part most men miss. Her reaction is not your responsibility. If she gets upset, let her be upset. If she withdraws, let her withdraw. Your job is not to manage her emotional state. Your job is to remain consistent, to stay solid, to demonstrate through your actions that you are not a weather vane that spins with every shift in her mood. Second, stop explaining yourself to the ground. Most men think that if they can articulate their reasoning clearly enough, thoroughly enough, she'll understand and the tension will dissolve. But over-explanation is not clarity. It's a request for permission. It's you unconsciously communicating that you need her approval before you can act. And the more you do it, the more she loses respect, because you're training her to see you as someone who needs her validation to exist. When you make a decision, state it once, calmly, without apology. "I'm doing this." Not, "I think I'm going to do this, but what do you think?" Not, "Is it okay if I do this?" Just a clear, clean statement of intent, and then move. Let your actions speak louder than your justifications. Third, refuse to absorb her bad moods as if they're your fault or your problem to fix. She comes home upset, and instead of immediately going into fix-it mode, asking 100 questions, trying to soothe her, manage her, make it better, you stay calm, you acknowledge it. Sounds like you had a rough day, and then you let it be. You don't take ownership of it. You don't let it infect your state. You remain separate. And that separateness, that refusal to be emotionally hijacked, is what creates safety. Because if you can stay solid when she's in chaos, she knows you can stay solid when life actually gets hard. Fourth, protect your mission as if it were oxygen. Whatever you're building, your business, your craft, your body, your creative work, it is not secondary to the relationship. It is the relationship, because the moment you abandon what makes you capable, interesting, and self-contained, you stop being the man she was attracted to. Your mission is not something you do when there's time left over. It's the center of your life, and the relationship orbits it, not the other way around. This doesn't mean you ignore her. It means you stop pretending that your presence alone without purpose is valuable. It's not. A man without a mission is just a source of emotional labor, and emotional labor without direction is worthless. Fifth, Begin to move as if her approval is irrelevant. Not her presence, not her happiness, but her approval of your decisions. Make the choice you would make if she weren't watching. Take the job. Make the move. Start the project. And if she objects, listen to her concern, but don't let it override your judgment. Because the man who constantly defers to her opinion, who treats her feelings as more important than his own clarity, trains her to see him as someone who doesn't trust himself. And you cannot desire someone you don't trust. Now let's look at the two paths in front of you, because you're at a threshold, whether you realize it or not. What you do in the next 6 months will determine the shape of your life for the next decade. Path 1. You ignore all of this. You tell yourself it doesn't apply to you, or that your situation is different, or that she's not like other women, and you continue the pattern. You continue sacrificing your structure for temporary peace. You continue over-explaining, over-apologizing, and functioning. You continue treating her moods as emergencies you need to solve. And 5 years from now, you'll be smaller, more bitter, more confused. You'll have a list of grievances you never voiced and resentments you never processed. You'll look at other men who seem to command respect without trying, and you'll wonder what they have that you don't. And the answer will be the same thing you had before you gave it away. Boundaries. The difference is they kept theirs. You'll still be in relationships maybe, but they'll be hollow, transactional. You'll feel like a stranger in your own life, and the women you're with will feel it too. And the worst part is, you'll have no one to blame, because this was always your choice. Path 2. You take this as an initiation. You stop pretending that sacrifice equals love. You start protecting your time, your mission, your structure, not as a tactic to attract women, but as a requirement for self-respect. You rebuild your life around principles that don't require anyone's approval. You go to the gym not because it makes you attractive, but because it keeps you sane. You work on your projects not because they'll impress anyone, but because they give you purpose. You spend time alone not because you're avoiding intimacy, but because solitude is where you remember who you are. And in that process, something shifts. The women who would have drained you lose interest because you're no longer available to be drained. And the women who respect strength start noticing you differently. Not because you're performing dominance, but because you've stopped performing anything. You're just solid, consistent, unmoved by the drama you didn't create. And that solidity is magnetic in a way that availability never will be. 5 years from this path, you'll have fewer people in your life, but the ones who remain will be real. You'll have less noise, but more clarity. You'll have walked away from situations that would have destroyed you, and you won't regret a single one because you'll know that protecting your boundaries wasn't cruel. It was the only kind of love that actually works. Here's the core thesis one more time, stripped down to bone. Boundaries don't create distance, they create respect. And respect is the only soil in which a sire can grow. The moment you make yourself endlessly available, endlessly flexible, endlessly willing to abandon your own structure for someone else's comfort, you stop being a man anyone can desire. Not because you're not good enough, but because you've erased the very thing that made you worth desiring in the first place. A woman doesn't kill your mission. She reflects its absence. If you had a mission you were unwilling to compromise, she wouldn't be able to derail you. The fact that she can is not her fault. It's yours. If this hit something in you, if you felt the weight of recognition somewhere in your chest, then share it. Subscribe. Keep this work alive for the men who need it. Not because I need your validation, but because there are men right now standing at the same threshold you're standing at, and they need to know they're not insane for feeling what they feel. A man who defends nothing ends up with nothing worth defending.